Very much. We're very excited about having Dr. Nate Sanders speak to us today. It's been a really exciting program and the most registrants we've had for any program in a year. So I hope more of them show up to hear this. Right, Nate was, we knew we wanted to do something on Darwin to celebrate Darwin's Day. So I went to a group in Colorado at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, which is down in Crested Butte, Colorado, and asked for a suggestion, and they gave me Nate's name. And in communicating with him, he said that to tell you that he grew up in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains, and I should have asked him which part of the Ozarks, because I'm from Missouri, but fell in love with the Rocky Mountains in high school. He attended the University of Colorado, where he got his he got his BA in environment, population, and organismic biology. And then he got his PhD from Stanford University in ecology. He works at the University of Michigan and he teaches there. And he says his research is at the interface of community ecology, ecosystem ecology, and macroecology, with a focus on how global change drivers and interspecific interactions influence the causes, consequences of biodiversity loss. The aim of his research is to forecast the effects of environmental change on biodiversity, and he does that by studying ants and plant-insect interactions. When I asked him, like a short description of what he was going to talk about, because what I just read you was pretty technical, he wrote back and said, I'm going to talk about ants and other cool stuff. So I've seen a few of his videos as we were setting up, and you better put yourself on mute, or you're going to be going, oh, because they're really cool stuff. The last thing I want to say about Nate is that we offer I didn't check with him that I could announce this, but I will anyway. We give our speakers an honorarium, a fairly generous one of $200. And when I asked Nate where I should send it, he said, we should donate it to a food bank in Colorado. So we have a long connection with the Action Center in Jefferson County, as Helena knows, and some of the others we had before the virus. We regularly stacked cardboard boxes with foods, and they did have, I hope it's still operating, a kind of a grocery store where people go in and get food for free. So that's where our $200 will be going. So thank you, Nate, for speaking, and thank you very much for your generosity. So I will remind you again, please put yourself on mute. You don't need to get rid of your video, but please put yourself on mute so we can hear whatever else you do. And I'm going to turn it over to Nate. Oh, I will also remind you, put questions in the chat, and I will ask them when the presentation is over.
Great. Am my volume okay? Everybody can you hear me okay? See me okay? Thumbs up from anybody? Yes, okay, super. Yeah, so I am going to talk about ants and other cool stuff, but I also want to talk a little bit about Darwin as well, because as you know, his birthday is in about 3 weeks. So the title of the talk is Darwin's Enigmatic Little Things That Run the World, the Past, Present, and Future Domination of Ants. And so I've been working on ants for about 25 years now. I started at the University of Colorado working on ants as an undergrad. And I've worked with lots of great people. And so the next time you all are looking for someone to talk about ants or global change or biology or biodiversity, here is a list of incredible, incredible collaborators. Now, the ants are special to me. I grew up in the foothills of the Ozarks in Arkansas. It's been a long time since I've heard someone refer to Missouri as Missouri. So I really appreciated that, Nancy. It brought me home. I was born in Harrison, Arkansas, which is just right across the border from Missouri. And I spent a lot of time out running around in the woods looking for things like bobcats and bears and other things. And of course, you rarely see them. But what you always see are the ants. You could go on a walk on any warm day, almost anywhere on the planet, except for Antarctica or Iceland, and you would see ants crawling around. You could go on a picnic and drop a crumb of a cookie on the ground, and within seconds, ants will be there. Ants are on every continent except Antarctica. There are about 15,000 different ant species. My kinfolk in Arkansas think there are only 3: red ants, black ants, and fire ants. But it turns out there are 14,997 more different kinds of ants. And they come in all shapes and sizes. So this one on the left here is an ant called Paraponera clavata. It's the bullet ant. It's the biggest ant. You'll see just how big it is in just a second. The one on the right is one of the smallest ants. It's an ant called Brachymyrmex, and it's about the size of a period in the Denver Post newspaper. Whereas this ant on the left is about the size of half your thumb. So they come in all shapes and sizes, orders of magnitude of body size difference. It's often been said that ants weigh as much or more than all other vertebrates combined. So if you were able to go out into a forest in, say, Costa Rica, and scoop up every single ant that's crawling around and weigh that mass of ants, then you scooped up all the other vertebrates. The ants would weigh about twice as much as the vertebrates. And so this picture is drawn to scale to show the relative biomass, the relative weight of ants to other vertebrates in forest ecosystems. I think it also shows the relative importance of ants to vertebrates in terrestrial ecosystems. Now, folks in Colorado and other places have experience with ants. You've probably been stung by an ant. You should know that there are 2 different approaches that ants have. One is that they bite and then tear your skin and then spray formic acid into that tear, or they bite and then bend around and sting you. And so this is a case of an ant that's stinging you. I should also introduce my dog, Rosalind. So if you see me bend down like this, I'm patting Rosalind, the yellow lab, on the ear. Rosalind, named after Rosalind Franklin, for you folks who know about the discovery of DNA. So ants sting. Probably many people in this room have been stung. This is a fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, common in Texas, marching toward Colorado as we speak. This is what it looks like when you get stung by a bunch of fire ants. And so all of these little pustules that you see are fire ant stings. And they're called fire ants because it feels like your leg is burning when you get stung. But the ant that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, Paraponera clavata, has the common name the bullet ant, because when you get stung by a bullet ant, it feels like you've been shot by a bullet. Now, you may have heard that there's an entomologist at the University of Arizona named Steve Schmidt. And what Schmidt has done is the craziest experiment in the history of experiments. He has traveled around the world letting insects sting him, and then he rates that sting on a pain index called the Schmidt Pain Index. And you should know, he should know, that the bullet ant has the most painful sting of any insect on the planet. And it really does feel like you've been shot by a bullet. Here's a finger for scale to show you how big these things are. And so what this ant is doing right now is it's latching on to that very soft skin on this poor soul's finger. And you can see it bending around right now. It has 2 waists that allow it to bend around, and it's stinging this guy's finger. And he's going to be, you know, TikTok famous or YouTube famous for letting this ant sting him on the finger. Now, almost anytime I talk about fire ants anywhere in the world, people say, oh yes, we have fire ants where I live. Well, in Colorado, where you are, you actually don't have fire ants. The most common ant that you've probably seen is this ant, which is called the Western harvester ant. It's a seed harvesting ant, Paganomyrmex occidentalis, and it makes these conical nests that you've seen in any arid ecosystem in Colorado. So on the Front Range, you'll see these. In sort of south central Colorado, you'll see lots of these. What's cool about them is that they make these conical nests. This is about 1 foot high, but they change the face of that nest over the course of the year, so that the broadest surface on that nest tracks the sun, because ants are ectotherms. And if you live in a cold place like Colorado, you want to be able to track the sun. So it's almost like they have a solar panel mounted on the colony, and they're just tracking the sun as it moves over the course of a year, which is really cool, sustainable architecture. So just quick show of hands. How many of you saw Ant-Man? Raise your hand. Yeah, lots of folks. Some people, yeah, good. How many of you saw the next one? Ant-Man and Wasp. Oops, probably not quite as many saw Ant-Man and Wasp. All right, so the crazy thing for me is, of course, I went to see Ant-Man as soon as it came out, and we were in Crested Butte, Colorado at the time, and we went out into the parking lot, and my kids, who at the time were, I don't know, 8 and 5, something like that, they said, "So, Dad, what did you think? What did you think?" And if you know the plot of this movie, great. If you don't know the plot of this movie, I don't think this is a spoiler. But what Ant-Man can do is shrink down to the size of an ant, and then he can communicate with the ants. And so at the end of the movie, the way he defeats the bad guys is that he gets all of these ants from all over the world, army ants from Africa, and then bullet ants from Central America, to all converge on San Francisco to overtake the bad guys' lair. And so my kid said, "So what'd you think?" And I said, "Well, I don't really understand how those ants got all the way from South America and Africa to San Francisco at exactly the moment Ant-Man wanted them to arrive." And then my 5-year-old said, "Wait, but so you're okay with the fact that he could shrink down to the size of an ant and communicate with the ants? That part you were okay with. It was just like, how do all those ants get from Central America to San Francisco? That's the part you didn't get." And I said, "Well, actually, yeah, that's right." So how many of you have seen this movie? This is a cult classic from way back. If you didn't see it when it first came out, you might be able to see it at 1:30 a.m. on your local off the record TV station. This is a movie called Them. It was made right at the height of the Cold War. The premise of the movie is that radioactive waste spills in the desert in Nevada. That's never happened, as you know. And when that radioactive waste spills, some of it spilled into this ant colony. And any scientist knows that once you spill radioactive waste down into an ant colony, the ants grow to be the size of, SUVs. And then the ants go around rampaging and destroying cities. The army has to get called in. This movie, though, I should say, was way ahead of its time because it had a female scientist in a lead role. And so this was made in like 1956. And if you think about, who was on TV at that time, it was June Cleaver, waiting for her husband to come home from work. It was just, this was way ahead of its time in having a female scientist, especially in a lead role. The only issue, though, is that this is her right here. You can see this is how she was in the movie. This is what happened to her. But nevertheless, incredible cult classic. So how many of you have read this book? I've given a version of this talk probably 200 times. No one has ever read this book. No one should ever read this book, let me tell you. So I had heard about this book for a long time, and I finally found it in the back, section, free books at a used bookstore, and picked it up and started reading it, hoping that it was going to be about, some great story about fire ants and the ecology of fire ants. It turns out to be essentially softcore porn, unbeknownst to me. And even now, when I think back on when I found this book in this used bookstore, I was blushing and so embarrassed, and closed it immediately. And I thought, well, I still have to buy this book, right? I mean, it's the fire ants. And so even now talking about it 15 years later, I still blush that I bought this book, which turns out is not about ants. How many of you have ever had this beer? This is another one where very few people have ever had it. I think this was a one-off beer, actually, by this brewery in Southern California, where they made this porter, which is called a honey ant porter. And these are actually ants that occur in Colorado, where the workers go out and collect liquid resources like nectar, other sorts of liquid resources, and they store those liquids in their abdomen. And their abdomens can swell up to be about the size of a lemon drop. And because they're out collecting sweet foods, you can actually dig these colonies up and pop them into your mouth. And they do taste like lemon drops. And so this is just someone's hand for scale. These were delicacies to native peoples over Colorado and the southwestern US. And when you can find them, which I've been lucky enough to collect a couple of them, it's really, really amazing. You can actually bring these colonies into the lab and then feed colonies different kinds of liquid resources. So if you wanted to feed one colony like a cherry soda, and another colony chocolate soda, and another colony lemonade, you could have lemonade flavored ants, chocolate flavored ants, or fruit punch flavored ants. How many of you have ever heard of this restaurant called Noma? Anybody? It's in Copenhagen. A handful of people have. For many, many years, it was the #1 restaurant in the world. And we were in Copenhagen for a while, and we're lucky enough to go. And it's one of those places that brings you, incredibly locally sourced food, 21 to 25 small plates over the course of many, many hours, little glasses of wine that are paired with each course. And so by the end of the night, you're really, really drunk and really, really full, but it's just been an amazing experience. Here's one dish they brought out to us, my wife and me, when we were there. And what it is a slice of beef with frozen ants sprinkled on it. And these are ants that you might find in Colorado, especially at high elevations. These are wood ants that make those sort of thatch mounds. So frozen ants sprinkled on beef with a little bit of olive oil drizzled over it. And when this came out, I had to say, I'm a nerd. I don't ever say this anywhere I go, but I know a lot about ants. So can we just talk about how the chef decided to use these ants in this way on this dish? And so again, this is like at the #1 restaurant in the world, serving ants as food. So we've talked about, great movies, Ant-Man, Them, horrible books, The Fire Ants, beer even, ants as food. Does anyone know the fashion designer Paul Smith? Has anybody ever heard of Paul Smith? Sir Paul Smith, I should say. My wife was in a conference in Paris, and so I tagged along. And while she was working, I was just walking all over the city, and I saw this little fashion designer studio. And there was this tie right here in the middle of the screen. I saw it in the window, and I thought, oh, I'll have to buy that tie. For the one day a year I have to wear a tie. And so I went in, and of course the tie was like $325. But as I looked around, everything in the store had ants on it. So this is a long sleeve shirt with the ants on it, these cool pants with ants crawling up them, a scarf with ants. Everything was out of my price range. I walked around looking at all this stuff, and then I asked the woman working in the shop, I study ants. Do you mind if I take a few pictures of all this cool stuff that Paul Smith has designed? And so she allowed me to, and I took a few snapshots. And then I said, so what was Paul Smith thinking? Why did he devote the entire spring line to ants? And she said, I don't know, but he's just standing right over there. You could ask him. And so Paul Smith, you can find documentaries about him on YouTube. The only way to describe him really is that he's like a sober Keith Richards. He's really gregarious, super funny, incredible guy. And so I went up and asked him, Sir Smith, why ants? And he said, oh, they're just so cool. And I said, oh, I study ants. And he said, oh, tell me about them. And so I told him some of the things I've been doing. And he said, you have to buy a t-shirt. And so we walked over and looked at this t-shirt. And this t-shirt was 225 euros. And Paul Smith gets it off the rack, looks at it and said, Jesus, who the hell prices these things? I'll give you 20% off. And I said, oh no, my wife would kill me if I bought a t-shirt for 200 euros. And so we kept talking for a little while, and that became 30 minutes of just Paul Smith and I talking about ants and a little bit of fashion. After about 30 minutes, his assistant came in and said, Paul, we got to get out of here. And Paul Smith said, you won't believe it, but this guy studies ants. And perfectly timed, his assistant said, aren't ants really important for how ecosystems work? And I said, yes, they are. And then Paul Smith said, shit, give this guy a t-shirt. And so here's me and Paul Smith with my free Paul Smith t-shirt, which was, 225 euros for this shirt. And you can see Paul Smith, you could imagine him being like a sober Keith Richards. So ants have inspired, lots of great literature, lots of great books, lots of great movies. And I could talk about all that for a while, but I also want to talk about the ecology for a while. Now, there are lots of ants. As I said, there are 15,000 species of ants, but there are also lots of individual ants crawling around. You may have seen many of them in your yard or in your kitchen. A friend of mine named Rob Dunn did some work in Manhattan, the most densely populated city in the United States. And what they did was they estimated the number of ants out crawling around at any one time. And that number is this big number, 1.23 trillion ants. And there are about 1.6 million people living in Manhattan. The size of these two circles, this is the people circle, this is the ant circle, shows the relative abundance of ants to people in Manhattan, the most densely populated city in the United States for people. So imagine in this place that has more people than anywhere else, there are still this many more ants out crawling around. There are lots of ants out crawling around, and they do lots of really important things. It turns out that more than half of all plant species rely on ants to disperse their seeds. And so many plants have evolved this mechanism by which they attach this thing. This is called an elaiosome. It's like a Snickers bar attached to a seed. The ants pick up these seeds, they bring it back to the nest. The ants rip off the elaiosome. They eat that nutrient-rich elaiosome, and then they deposit the seed in their trash heap, which is a fertilized piece of soil. So you can imagine that it's good for plants to have their seeds dispersed by ants. It's so common that about 20% of all angiosperms, about 11,000 plant species, rely on ants to disperse their seeds. Some of you may have been to Central America, and you may have seen leafcutter ants crawling around. And this is just some really cool footage from YouTube that you can see. If you haven't seen these things, they are simply amazing. So the ants go out and they clip these leaves, they bring it back. They don't eat the leaves. Instead, they use those leaves to raise a fungus garden in their nest. And just thinking about these tiny little things carrying these giant weights to and fro from the plant that they've just clipped, you can see one clipping here, back to their nest, is just an incredible, incredible feat of nature. But again, they're not eating the leaves, they're using those leaves to raise a fungus, and then they're eating the fruiting bodies of those fungi. Now, the other really cool thing that happens is that these ants carry these leaves back to their nest, and their colony mates, their sisters, and this is something we'll come back to in just a minute, their sisters ride these leaves back, protecting them from parasitoid flies. So there are these flies that make a living by finding these streaming leaves that have ants underneath them. The flies buzz around, then they zoom down and drill a hole in this ant's head and lay an egg there. Now, I have no idea whether you all have brothers or sisters, but you have a genetic investment in protecting your sisters from things that drill holes in their skull. And so these colony mates, these sisters, are protecting their sisters from these forward flies. Now, as you saw in the video, the ants run really, really fast, both away from their colony to get the leaves and then pick the leaf up and run back. Just to put that in human terms, this is the world record holder in the marathon, a guy from East Africa named Eliud Kipchoge. And he won the Berlin Marathon in 2 hours and 1 minute and 39 seconds. That's an incredible pace of about 4 minutes and 40 seconds per mile. I can't run a single mile that fast, but he just ran 26 of them that fast to set the world record. But if Eliud knew how fast ants run, even he would be impressed. So what an ant does is it leaves the colony, and if you scale up how fast it's running and the distance it runs, these ants run the equivalent of a marathon to go out and pick this leaf up at a pace of about 3 minutes and 45 seconds per mile. Then they clip this leaf, and then they carry the leaf back. That leaf that they're carrying back weighs about as much as a refrigerator. So imagine you just ran a marathon at a pace of 3 minutes and 45 seconds. You run through the finish line, everyone claps, and then someone says, here's a refrigerator, carry it back. Oh, and your sister is going to ride on top of that refrigerator. And then when you run back at a pace of about 4 minutes and 25 seconds per mile with the refrigerator and your sister riding on that refrigerator. It's just crazy to me. But the other thing that's crazy is that these ants, as I said, are bringing these leaves back, they chew them up, and then they use those leaves to to grow a fungus, and they eat the fungus. That's all they eat. So what these ants are really doing is practicing agriculture, right? They are growing a crop that they eat. They can't persist without this crop. If you think about, again, in human terms, think about when did we evolve agriculture? When did human society start relying on agriculture in a consistent way? Turns out it's about 10,000 years ago that humans started doing that. The ants started doing that about 70 million years ago. So for 70 million years, the ants have been practicing agriculture. We developed it about 10,000 years ago. Now this story gets even more interesting. Biologists have studied these leafcutter ant systems for a long time, and they've often wondered, what are these little white spectacles that appear on the bottom of some of the workers in these leafcutter colonies? Well, it turns out that the ants eat this fungus. This is a fungus called the leucoprene fungus. There's also a parasite of the fungus. So this is something that wants to eat the ant's crop. If you are a farmer, you don't want pests or parasites eating your crop. Well, it turns out that what these little white specks are on the undersides of these ants is something called streptomyces. Streptomyces, it turns out, is an antibiotic. So ants have been using antibiotics for tens of millions of years. Humans have been using antibiotics for tens of years, which is just amazing. Again, the ants have figured this out. They've also figured out lots of really cool behaviors and ways to outcompete one another. So here are two of my favorite ants. This is an ant called Paganomyrmex barbatus. It's a seed harvester, like the one that's common in Colorado. This big dark ant is called Novomessor cockerelli. Not only is it an elegant ant, but it's also really fun to say, Novomessor cockerelli. Both of these ants compete for seeds in the desert. This ant, the purple ant, Novomessor cockerelli, starts its day a little bit earlier. So, 4:30, 4:15, these ants start popping out of the nest. These ants start typically 5:15, something like that. Novomessor sneaks over to the nest of Paganomyrmex and drops tools and sticks down into the nest and plugs the nest entrance. And so while the ants are trying to dig out, the Novomessor ants are walking around picking up all the seeds. And by the time they finally dig out, it's too hot for them to forage. So what these ants are doing is using a tool in competition. They're using a tool in warfare. Here's another example. This is an ant called Aphenogaster occidentalis. We put out these little cotton balls and soaked them in honey because we wanted to see ants fighting for resources. What we saw instead was, you can see this tiny little ant right here. These ants are putting little fragments of leaves and twigs onto the cotton balls. Then they're letting those little fragments of leaves soak up the honey water or the sugar water. And then they're carrying those back to the nest because they can't get enough of the liquid resource to carry back to the nest just in their mandibles, and it would evaporate or they would spill it. And so what they're doing is using a tool to collect resources. Now, when Jane Goodall discovered that chimpanzees use tools, it shook the world because we realized that maybe we're not the first organisms on this planet that have figured out how to use tools. Chimpanzees have figured it out over the previous 30,000 years or so. Ants have likely been using tools for, again, tens of millions of years. They've also used these incredible collective behaviors that you might recognize if you've ever played tug of war or ever had to get 3 or 4 of your friends to move a giant couch or something like that. So this is daisy chaining behavior, where you can see these ants are basically, she is pulling that ant, she's pulling that ant, and then there's some ants pulling on the sides. So again, there's this amazing collective behavior that emerges that, especially in this day and age, is hard to imagine seeing humans doing that much. Here's an example of collective behavior where these big fat things up here, these are termites, and then they have a row of termite soldiers protecting them. These are ants, and they have a row of soldier ants protecting them. And you can see this amazing standoff between the soldiers of both the ants and termites. It's almost like, it's a fight between two rival high schools where everyone acts like they want to fight, but they don't really fight. And so again, you can see that there's this standoff. You can imagine how this has fitness benefits for both the termites and the ants. By not engaging in warfare, no one dies and no one is harmed. Ants are voracious predators. This is one of my favorite ants. This is an ant called Odontomachus, and it walks around with its mandibles at 180 degrees like this. And whenever it finds something it wants to eat, those mandibles slam shut. Here's a picture of them finding a little springtail. The mandibles slam shut. My friend Andy Suarez brought these into the lab and measured the force of those ants slamming their mandibles shut. And it's the strongest force measured in the animal kingdom. So you think about crocodiles and alligators slamming their mouths shut. You can think about all kinds of big scary mammals, sharks, for example. But that force is the strongest force ever measured in the animal kingdom. He had them in the lab and he noticed they were doing this sort of strange thing. So if you watch this ant down here on the ground, its mandibles are spread out on the ground and it slams them shut. And then it just catapults itself. I mean, this is, that would be like me doing the splits here in my basement and then slamming my legs shut and then catapulting myself over the roof of my house. If this were the Olympics, that would be like a 720 times 3, completely worthy of a gold medal if she sticks the landing. And this ant didn't stick the landing, but it's still a crazy feat to imagine these ants launching themselves into the air. So Andy wondered why they do that. How did that behavior evolve? It turns out that there are these amazing creatures called ant lions. Here's one. You've probably seen them in Colorado. They dig pits in very loose soil. And as ants and other insects walk across this loose soil, they fall into the pit. And so here's a video of that. And you can see this ant. She's starting to fall down into the bottom of this pit. And then you'll see these giant mandibles emerge in just a second of this ant lion that's trying to eat her. And then our friend the ant is going to say, you know what? I'm getting out of here. And so you can imagine how that evolves as well. That if you can avoid being eaten, that's great for you. But if you can also use that same tool to capture your prey, that's also great for you. But the list of adaptations goes on and on and on and on. There are ants that have evolved mutualisms with plants such that the plants provide the ants with food, they provide them with shelter, and then the ants protect those plants from their competitors. So you can see it looks like someone has been running a weed eater around this plant, when in actuality, the ants are out crawling around, clipping all of the vegetation around their host plant. So they're removing all of the weeds so that their plant does better. If an herbivore like a giraffe or elephant or intrepid ant biologist comes and puts any finger on this plant, within seconds, the ants come pouring out and sting you immediately. Ants have huge effects on ecosystems as well. So this is a redwood ant nest in the Black Forest of Germany. And there's Israel del Toro for scale. They have huge effects on soil nutrient dynamics and other ecosystem properties. This is a picture from Colorado showing this ring of fertility around this ant nest, because this is where the ants are putting all of their refuse. And so it's a ring of fertilizer impacting these plant communities. Here's a schematic showing what some ant nests look like below ground. So we see these things on top of the ground, but below ground, they can be giant caverns. And so I have no idea why the people who drew this picture had this person with a little dust broom or rake or whatever he's doing. And every time I show it, I always crack up because you can see this handle is being jammed into his face. But they can just have huge impacts below ground as well. Now, I've said a couple things without really pointing them out. And one is that I've referred to ants as she, or you can see she's crawling on this. Every ant you've probably ever seen crawling around is a female. Ants dominate the world. Most ants that you've seen are females. And so it's clear to me that women dominate the world and are doing all these cool things that evolution has favored for millions and millions and millions of years. But occasionally what you see are ants with wings. So these are pictures from Colorado. This is an ant called Acromyrmex versicolor. What happens in places like Arizona and Colorado is that once a year, usually the first warm day after the first summer monsoon, ants everywhere release their winged reproductives. So this is males and females. Ants of the same species somehow find each other and mate. And so somewhere in the middle of this is a single female future queen being mated. She mates. You can see this is a future queen. These are males. You can see how small the heads are of these males. The males live for 1 day and then they die. Then the queens rip off their wings. They dig a hole in the ground. And then after about a year, they start producing fertilized eggs, which turn into workers. And so the basic life history is that there's a queen, she's mated, she goes underground, she never mates again. She stored all that sperm from those initial mating bouts, and then she just makes workers for the rest of her life. Just to point out again how unimportant males are in this system, this is a future queen being mated by a male. You can see how small his body is and how small his head is relative to her. Here's a queen with all of her workers. Here's an army ant worker with their queen. This queen is about the size of my pinky finger. And so ants come in all shapes, all sizes, all colors. They have incredible, incredible behaviors. They do so many things. I mean, some of the things I just talked about were things like sustainable architecture with the ants that track the sun over the course of the year. They are, by some measures, the most abundant organisms anywhere on the planet. They've been practicing agriculture for tens of millions of years, using tools. They're dominant herbivores. They have powerful chemical weapons that, of course, the US Army is interested in. Powerful mechanical weapons, again, which the US Army is interested in. So it's critically important to understand how they've become so successful. One of the things that Charles Darwin was most interested in was trying to explain the natural world by his concepts related to evolution by natural selection or descent with modification. However, Darwin was perplexed by the ants, and he wrote to a friend, "I confine myself to one special difficulty, which at first appeared to me insuperable and actually fatal to my whole theory. I allude to the neuters or sterile females in insect communities, for these neuters often differ widely in instinct and in structure from both the males and fertile females, and yet from being sterile, they cannot propagate their kind." And so Darwin's whole idea is that natural selection operates on variation among individuals. Hang on one second, I'm being beeped at. And if that variation leads to differential reproductive success, then the whole thing works. But in an ant colony, the only ants that are reproducing are the queens. All those ants you see crawling around on the ground, if you spill Kool-Aid on your front porch, those are workers who don't reproduce. And so the question is, how could evolution by natural selection favor sterility in workers? If the goal is to maximize your fitness, the number of offspring you have in future generations, how could natural selection shape the success or lead to the success of the most dominant organisms on Earth? Well, as it turns out, males and ants come from unfertilized eggs. So they have only half of the genome of their mother. Females are diploid. They are fertilized eggs. Because of that weird haplodiploidy, it's called, where males have only half the genome of their parents and females get half from mom, half from dad, it turns out that female workers share on average 75% of their DNA, of their genes, with their sisters, but they share only 50% if they were to have their own babies, because those babies would would have DNA from dad and DNA from mom. And so their babies would have only 50% of their DNA. But because of this weird haplodiploidy system, female workers actually have more genetic investment in their sisters, in helping their sisters, than they do in helping their own offspring. So the reason that sterile females have evolved in the ants is because they get more genetic bang for their buck. They get more wins in evolution by natural selection by helping their sisters than they would by having their own offspring. Now, as I said, I've been studying ants for a long time for many of the reasons I just told you, all these really cool behaviors, all these really important ecological impacts that ants have. And I started studying ants here at the Henderson Museum of Natural History at the University of Colorado, which is an amazing place. And in the Henderson Museum, there's an amazing book called The Ants of Colorado, which was written by someone who used to be a professor at the University of Colorado named Robert E. Gregg. And his entire research program was essentially driving around Colorado looking for ants. And he wrote down everything he saw about the ants, where they occurred, what elevation they were at, how big the nests were. And so I took all of the data out of that book and I asked a simple question. What elevations have the most ant species, the most different kinds of species? Turns out it's not the lowest elevations, it's too hot and dry. It's not the highest elevations where it's too cold. It's those mid elevations, which are the sweet spot for ants. It's not too dry, not too hot, but it's that mid elevation sweet spot. So I went on to go do lots of work in lots of places and mountains around the world. Even globally, we went around the world trying to understand why some places have more ant species than others. It turns out that temperature matters a lot to ants. Ants, like other insects, are ectothermic. If it gets too hot, they can't be active. If it's too cold, they can't be active. And temperature really influences their degree of activity. We did an experiment where we, at cold places in Harvard Forest and warm places at Duke Forest in North Carolina, where we heated up big patches of the forest using these greenhouses, basically, where the ants could fly in or crawl under. And some of the things we found were pretty amazing. We found that temperature affected when the ants were active. And so this figure on this axis just shows how much warmer we made it in those experimental chambers, so up to 5 degrees warmer. And then the day of the year that the ants were most active. And so under the control conditions, where we didn't change the temperature at all, the day that the ants are the most active under normal conditions is July 19. But as we warm it up, you see that the ants are getting out earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. And in the hottest plots, the day of highest activity was May 5th. So by increasing this temperature experimentally, we change the phenology, or we change the activity cycle of these ants really dramatically. We also looked at how increases in temperature affected the activity day to day of these ants. And so what my former grad student Katie Stubble did was she went out every hour for 24 hours over several days and just asked, how many hours a day do these ants spend foraging? So this ant here, this is Aphenogaster rudus. It's that really important seed disperser that I told you about earlier. This ant in red is Chromatogaster lineolata. It doesn't disperse seeds at all. Under normal conditions, what we find is that Aphenogaster is out about 10 hours a day, and this is the ant that does most of the seed dispersing that plants rely on. Chromatogaster is out about 7.5 hours a day. It doesn't disperse seeds at all. But once we turn up the temperature just a little bit, what we find is that Aphenogaster rudus shuts down almost completely and doesn't leave the nest. Whereas Chromatogaster lineolata, this ant which doesn't disperse seeds at all, is drinking a 6-pack of Red Bull and is just out 24 hours a day going crazy. Now remember, this is the ant that is out doing all of the seed dispersal. More than half of all ant species or more plant species rely on this ant to disperse seeds. we did an experiment where we put out these kinds of seeds and watched what happened to them. 146 times out of 147 times we saw something happen to a seed, these ants were carrying the seeds away. So with increasing temperatures, this really important seed disperser quits functioning in ecosystems. Now the question is, what happens as the planet continues to get warmer and warmer and warmer? When you think about all of these important ecosystem functions and services that ants provide, all of these incredible behaviors that have evolved, how huge numbers of them are everywhere, how will all of that change as a result of ongoing climate change? The short answer is I think the ants will persist. Human populations will suffer, plant populations for many, many species will suffer, mammal species will go locally extinct. But if there is any lesson to be learned from the ants, it is what are the mechanisms and behaviors that they have evolved to persist over tens and hundreds of millions of years and thrive? What can we learn from the ants? I think the answer is lots. We just have to study them. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you all for the tremendous opportunity. I admire the kinds of work and community involvement that you all have. And I hope you keep it up. And I hope you, like me, are happy that science matters again. So thanks.
Thank you, Nate. That was just fascinating. I have seen the ant, the newer ant movies, but I've also seen them. So
yes, awesome. That's great.
It was really a long time ago. Right. Well, we do have questions. I think we'll start with kind of a weird one, which is what did the beef with the ants taste like?
Exactly like you can imagine it. So those ants taste really super lemony. So it's citric acid just spilled on a steak. So imagine, you know, a really, really, really bitter lemon on a really nice piece of meat.
Interesting. So here's another question. What are the differences between human evolution and insect evolution? What have the evolutionary features of ants since, what's about since Darwin, do you know, in ants?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, there are only a couple of rules of evolution by natural selection, and that is that there's variation among individuals. That variation is heritable, and if that heritable variation confers differential reproductive success, then evolution can happen. I think that's true of ants, of people, of beetles, of microbes, etc. I do think that the ants have been at it a lot longer, and so have had more opportunities to evolve new behaviors and new abilities that we just haven't yet. You know, we communicate by speaking to one another. We communicate a little bit with facial expressions. We've developed other means of communicating like sign language. Ants rely on a whole suite of completely different means of communicating with one another, whether it's by stridulation or vibration, or the more well-known chemical communications. And so I think that, you know, that tens and hundreds of millions of years of a head start that the ants got on us has allowed them to diversify in ways that humans just haven't yet, and might not, for that matter.
Here's an interesting one. Did ants originate in a particular area of the world, like humans seem to have started in Africa and then immigrated out to other parts of the world? Have you found a primary location?
Yeah, so ants have been around since before Pangea, and so they were on Pangea, and then as Pangea broke apart, there were ants that moved with continental plates. And so there are a couple of examples of some really charismatic species that you find, you know, on the coast of Eastern Africa, and then the northwest coast of Australia. And the only explanation for that is that those ants were a single population, whatever it was, 125 million years ago, and now have become two distinct populations of the same species.
So ants would have been a really early evolved species or not quite sure what the
Yes,
word is,
yes, that's right.
that just persisted?
Absolutely. So they've persisted like, sharks and alligator gar and turtles. They've been around through thick and thin. And so I think that is one of the lessons, is how have they persisted for tens of millions of years when most species over that time period have gone extinct.
Hey, Nate, real quick, this is Matthew. Could you go ahead and stop sharing your screen if
Yeah,
you're done?
I
with
was
the
just
slide?
going to
Oh,
say
sure.
that. Yeah, so we
Oh,
could
thank
see
you, Nancy.
people's friendly faces. Yeah, that's
There we
great.
go.
Okay, well, the questions are coming fast and furious.
Good.
When did humans figure out that ants were using antibiotics? When did
Yeah,
they,
that's
how did they
around,
discover that?
yes, that's around 1999, I think. And interestingly, it was a grad student, not some, fancy pants professor, a grad student who did it. And so he discovered that there was a parasite in the fungus garden. And so then he just did a very simple experiment where he scraped off that white stuff under the ant and then put it in a petri dish with the parasite and looked at what happened. And so then the parasite started to die. And so then they looked at natural variation and how ants use that antibiotic. And sure enough, some colonies are better at using it than others.
Here's a question about the leaf writing sisters. How did their being on top of that leaf protect the carriers underneath having their heads drilled?
Yeah, so if you remember that picture, so the ants are sort of riding on that leaf. If the forward fly zooms down to drill a hole in the ant's head, the ants on the leaf rear up and try and bat it away, or they'll jump off the leaf and try and hit the forward fly. So they really are, just they're like bouncers at your favorite bar. They are preventing forward flies from attacking their sister physically.
How do queen ants develop? Where do they come from? Are any of their offspring developing? Do any of their offspring develop into queens?
Yeah, so I gave you the short, typical version of how ants come to be, and that is that this queen gets mated once, she goes underground and starts pumping out these workers. So future queens and future males also come from her, and so she is regulating which eggs get fertilized, which will become queens or female workers, and which ants don't, or which eggs don't get fertilized, those become the males. And then then there's different nutritional aspects that go into it to decide who will be the reproductives. And so it's a diet coupled with whether the egg is fertilized or not.
And any clue as to how she determines who becomes what?
So that's a huge area of research, because the sisters want more sisters, right? Because they share more of their DNA with sisters. But the queen doesn't care. The queen is, just popping out clones of herself if they're males, because those are unfertilized eggs. And so there's huge conflict between the queen, what the queen wants, and what the worker wants, because they both want to maximize their DNA in the next generation. And so it's a huge area of research. People are finding weird examples in species in Japan that just operate completely differently from this sort of textbook example. And so, ask that question again in 10 or 15 years, and I'll have a better answer, because it's a huge area of research right now.
All right, we'll have you back. It's a date.
Yes, yeah.
One of our members, I believe, was at the University of Colorado, and he wants to know if you knew E.O. Wilson personally, and if you interacted with him.
So I have met E.O. Wilson a handful of times. If you don't know, E.O. Wilson is an ant biologist, probably the biggest proponent of preserving biodiversity on the planet, and an all around incredibly brilliant human. I've met him a few times. He is amazing. If you find any book by him, buy it, check it out in the library. He's just incredible.
Okay. One of our members said that he had a client in upstate New York called Golden Artist Colors, who was interested in producing paint with little plastic ants in it, and wanted to know if you ever saw that.
I didn't. I'm clicking on this link right now, though, to see what that's all about.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will go on.
Yeah.
How exactly Darwin knew that some females were sterile? Just by observation, how did he determine that?
Yeah. So, you know, if you ever bought an ant farm and you didn't get a queen, what you would find is that eventually all those sterile workers would die.
Oh, okay.
They never reproduced. And so actually, you know, in the, this is not the right crowd for this story, but there's a famous proverb, look to the ants, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. So whenever that was written down, the folks who wrote it down, even then knew that the ants that were out crawling around on the ground were females. And so you know, I've asked almost everyone I know who thinks about how did knowledge come to be? How do we understand ant biology? How did whoever wrote that down know that ants were female? Because I just can't imagine it.
We have another question about Dr. Wilson. Can you talk about his role in the field of evolution?
Yeah, so E.O. Wilson has done many, many things. His focus since about 1990 has been mostly on conservation issues. But prior to that, you know, he worked a lot on evolution. And one of the things that he is most famous for is really documenting how differences among species either promote coexistence, like how evolution could lead to species to be different enough to coexist. But the topic that he is most famous for in evolution is about something called character displacement. So how competition between two species that are really, really similar leads to differentiation in them so that they can coexist. He more infamously has written a lot about human evolution. And if you're aware of this field called sociobiology that he popularized, it's controversial in many circles, but basically all he did was write about how evolution by natural selection works on a variety of different animal taxa in this book. And then the last chapter is about how evolution by natural selection might or might not apply to humans. And it was controversial at the time, and maybe even still, because some people saw it as him trying to justify the status quo in the state of affairs on the planet by making a biological argument. And folks, rightfully so, I think, were upset by this sort of deterministic view that allowed some people to say that white people in Western countries are successful because that's what natural selection has favored, which just obviously isn't right.
There was a similar question that came up, not here, but in another venue, about looking at our world today and the culture, the wars between people of different religions, people of different cultures, this lack of coexistence, and rather watching ants battle with each other, you know, teaches us anything about humans.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that there are lots of battles between ants. There are also just as many examples where they avoid battling, and there are lots of mechanisms for that. But I think that you know, you have to think about ants like brains, ant colonies like brains. You know, each individual ant is just a part of this entire community of other ants, and natural selection operates on the entire colony. So the colony is the unit of selection. Just like in your brain is a collection of neurons. Each individual neuron isn't so important. Of course, if you lost all of them, there would be dramatic consequences, just like in an ant colony. And so when you see these ant colonies battling, there may be some attrition of individual workers, but the colony persists. And I think, you know, I'm not suggesting that human society is anything like that. But what I am suggesting is that when we see these battles, it's not individuals battling individuals. It's just a part of an individual battling a part of an individual, and each individual colony persists. Whether there's a lesson there for humanity, I don't know, but I would say that just as many times as you have seen ants fighting, on sidewalks in Jefferson County, there are 10 times as many examples of when they don't fight.
Oh, that's good. Two more quick questions.
Yeah.
You talked about all these wonderful things that ants do. Can you give an example of anything you think humans learned and used from looking at ants?
Yeah, so one of the most interesting things is the way these colonies operate. So if you do think of a colony like a brain, and each individual ant is like a neuron, there is no central control. It's not the case that the queen is sitting on her throne with a scepter telling each ant to leave and go out and forage, or telling these ants to go fight with that colony, or these ants to go plug this nest over there. All of these decisions are made without hierarchical control. And so the way those decisions are made efficiently so that colonies, the entire colony, can thrive, I think is a huge area where we have lots of lessons to learn. And I think, the way information moves around colonies from worker to worker is probably an area that deserves a huge amount of research investment, because I think there are lots of opportunities to look at examples from nature, not just from ants, about efficiencies that have been evolved for tens of millions of years that we've been thinking about for only tens of years.
And then you mentioned fire ants moving northward, and we want to know,
Yeah.
is it partly a result of the climate change, do you think?
Yeah. So fire ants were introduced into Mobile, Alabama, accidentally in about 1952 or something like that. And since then, they've basically been marching northward and being distributed northward, mostly by the horticultural industry, because the fire ants move into greenhouses. And so, if there's like a 5-gallon pot with azaleas in it in a greenhouse, that is the perfect spot for a colony. That someone, at a Walmart in Bloomfield has azaleas delivered from somewhere in southern Missouri, and fire ants are now in Colorado. So it's partly climate change, but it's also more rapidly human commerce that's leading to the expansion of most invasive species around the world, not just ants.
We do have one more real quick question, and that, have you seen the movie Hellstrom's Chronicle?
Ooh, Hellstrom's Chronicle, no. Awesome.
You're going to have to unmute yourself and say why that matters, because I haven't seen it either, so I have no relation how that's related to ants. I guess it was Jack Udry who's.
Yeah, this is the Hellstrom's Chronicle is a legendary movie that actually paints insects in a very negative light, saying that they will eventually take over the planet and that humans will die off, but insects will prevail. And it's a fascinating movie, probably from the 1970s. I still recall the name of it, the Hellstrom's Chronicle.
Cool.
Huh, interesting.
That's really cool. So I would argue that insects have already taken over, and we're just hanging on. But
Trying to get rid of ants in our house in Hawaii, I will tell you, they have taken over. No choice. All right. So first, we really want to thank Nate. Why don't you all unmute long enough to clap for him? That's really fascinating. Really appreciate it. To thank you again for your donation to our food bank that we support. We really appreciate that. Then the very last thing we have is just a really quick plug for the February program, and it's really relevant, which you're going to hear in a minute. Bob, why don't you tell us about the February program?
Okay, back in August or September, when we were planning programs for next year, it seemed appropriate that we needed, considering what was going on in Washington, D.C., we needed a better understanding of the reach that a U.S. president had in terms of what he could really accomplish, or she could accomplish. And I contacted Lucy Dakins, and she suggested a law professor, Alan Chang, at the University of Colorado, University of Denver, Stroom College of Law. Well, it turns out that Professor Alan Chang had just written a book on that very subject, co-authored a book on the very subject entitled Free Speech Beyond Words, The Surprising Reach of the First Amendment. And the title of the program is going to be The Constitutional Limits on Unilateral Presidential Power, which I think is extremely pertinent to our time at this stage of the game. So I encourage you all, if you're interested in what a president can accomplish or not, come to the program on February
28th,
20 something.
28th, February 28th
28.
at 4 p.m.
Professor Chen is a Thompson G. March Law alumni professor at the University of Denver Strum College of Law. He teaches constitutional law, federal courts, and public interest law. So it's going to be a fascinating presentation. Don't miss it.
And very relevant. Matthew, do you have anything else to say? I guess not.
I do not.
Oh, all right, then we thank you all very much for coming. Nate, thank you again so much. It was a really, you talk about some really cool things.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank
You all
you.
keep up the good work. Keep up the
Oh,
good work.
thank
I
you.
really respect what you do a lot. So keep it up.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, all.
Bye, everyone.